Hello, wonderful people. Here we are in the middle of the Caminals lab. We're now going to talk about classification and evolution and taxonomy. So get my buttons going here. There we go. Classification and evolution. We'll get to taxonomy eventually. Humans classify everything, including each other. This habit can be quite useful at times, and at other times it can be a real pain in the rear. Here are some examples when classifying things is useful to us. For example, when talking about a vehicle, someone might describe it as a sedan with a fuel-injected V8 engine. A knowledgeable listener who has not seen the vehicle will still have a good idea of what it is like because of certain characteristics it shares with other familiar vehicles. There are three easy characteristics that are within the phrase, a sedan with a fuel-injected V8 engine. Can you spot them all? So a sedan tells us that it's a car, not a truck. Fuel injected means that it does not have a carburetor, it has fuel injection. And a V8 engine means that it has 8 cylinders arranged in a V pattern. So that's 1, 2, 3. Now, who are my motorheads out there? I am also a motorhead, thank you very much. So who can tell me the fourth characteristic? If you're not a motorhead, I'll give you a clue. How many doors does it have? Do you know? I will give you another clue. Put your answer into this spot. See, I did 1, 2, 3, and there's 4, and that's the answer. Sedans have 4 doors. Coupes have 2 doors. Both sedans and coupes are cars and not trucks. Trucks can have 2 or 4 doors, but they are not called coupes and sedans. So, humans have been classifying plants and animals for a lot longer than they have been classifying cars, but the principle is much the same. In fact, one of the central problems in biology is the classification of organisms on the basis of shared characteristics. Because humans have been doing this for thousands of years already, and it's hard to change things that have been done the same way for that long. We started off my just giving things names. We started off by, oh, that shouldn't be mine. We started off, so we, humanity, started off by just giving things names. Rose, corn, oak. But we also gave them other names. Flower, food, tree. What makes a flower is pretty obvious. Petals and the pollen inside. What makes a tree is also pretty obvious. It's made of wood that can be a few inches thick to even a few feet thick, and if you've ever been to the California redwoods, it can be 7 yards thick. But what makes any of these as a food is less obvious. We can eat the acorn off the oak tree. We can also eat a cow, but no one is suggesting cows are also plants. So what makes a plant a plant? At the most fundamental level, it is green and it captures the sunlight in order to grow. This definition of that word, plant, is over thousands of years old, much older than the language, English, that we are using for that word right here and now. For that word right here, right now. So different languages have different names for the same thing. Un moffet, ein stinkter, skunk, un zorrillo, sheshe. So what is the most fundamental problem in naming all living things within biology? The biggest problem is the sheer numbers of it all. We have over 1 million different species that have already been cataloged, studied, and named in various professional biology organizations. In fact, it might even be up over 2 million nowadays. That 1 million number I knew was correct, 15, 20 years ago. They might have doubled that since then. Now, if we eliminate single-celled species, then the total number of living species is definitely under 10 million. And I would say definitely under 5 million in my opinion, but that's just me, Steve Gruber, not a professional biologist. When we include all living things, then we guess that the total number of living species is probably over 10 million total, and maybe even up to near 100 million. Some biologists even say it might be just over 100 million. We don't know, of course. And this is only the living species. For every single species that is alive today, we can make a good guess that there were probably 20, maybe 100 species that have died out. So the immediate problem is we have a confirmed 1 million names of different species. 1 million names. That would fill 1 to 2 dozen average books if all we did was list the single name for each species. If we included a short description, so we could at least have an idea of what that species is if we don't instantly recognize the name, then we are already up to several hundred books. Several hundred books just to have a 3-sentence description of every single species that we can name. And the name is 1 word, maybe 2. And we're at several hundred books. So do you get a sense of the problem here? What is classification? Classification is the arrangement of organisms into orderly groups based on their similarities. Classification of living things is known as taxonomy, and taxonomists are scientists that identify and name organisms. I am also an amateur taxonomist. This has been a huge hobby of mine for over 25 years. Definitely, I'm 51 right here, right now, and I definitely remember getting into this. I had that chart. My first big chart was done when I was 30, and I'm sure I started doing charts around 26, 25, right after I got out of the Navy. Anyway, so taxonomy is something that's near and dear to my heart. What are the benefits of classifying? Well, we can accurately and uniformly name organisms. This prevents misnomers. Misnomer. Ask your English teacher. Such as starfish and jellyfish. Is a starfish a fish? No. Is a jellyfish a fish? No. Is a jellyfish made of jelly? Well, not like grape jelly, but if you've ever picked up a jellyfish, it does kind of feel like jelly. And starfish do look like a 5-pointed star, but they're not made of stars. Also, when we start naming these things on a professional level, we use the same languages. We try to always use Latin, but we sneak some Greek in there for all names. So there's our moufette, stinkdare, skunk, zorillo, shashay. But all those scientists who are speaking different languages, when they want to speak about this little animal there, who has a pretty cranky look on his face, and that's probably not good for the guy on the left there. What's the scientific name? Mephitis mephitis. Mephitis mephitis. Phytis? Phytis, I think. Mephitis. That's one of those words I only ever read. I never hear people say it. I'm 90% sure it's Mephitis mephitis. Another weird thing. Skunk is one of those that has the same genus species name. Anyway, that's the scientific name for that animal, Mephitis mephitis. So, how did all this get started? Well, for certain, and it's not 2,000 years ago. Aristotle lived 2,300 years ago. Grr. 2,300 some years ago, Aristotle was the first taxonomist. He divided organisms, all living things into plants and animals. Then he subdivided them by their habitat. Were they on land, on sea, or in the air? And he kept dividing them down from there. In 1660, right around the time of Isaac Newton, a guy named John Ray, he was the first to use Latin for naming names. And he did a kind of bad job of it. Oh yeah, in the second blurb. His names were very long descriptions telling everything about the plant. So in trying to be thorough, he was too thorough, and he just gave a long description of the plant rather than just a name. So, but still, it was better than what they had going before. Then 1735, Carol Linnaeus, who changed his name from Caroli Linnei the Carolus Linnaeus because that's how he made his system. If you get the joke right, if not, I'm not going to explain it. So he classified organisms by their structure, which was a big change rather than where they lived or a list of characteristics. And he developed the naming system that we still use today. So that got started in 1735, so almost 300 years ago. Carol Linnaeus is called the father of taxonomy, and he developed the binomial nomenclature, binomial, 2 words, nomenclature, system for naming things, the genus species. So this bird over here, the scientific name is Turdus migratorius. And that's an American robin. That's got some pretty bright color on the front of him for a robin. That robin's not from around here. Anyway, and that's the way you write it. The genus is capitalized with a T. The species is lowercase. Ideally, they're italicized. And if you're handwriting it, you can't. It's hard to write italicized. So then you just underline it when you're handwriting these things. And that's how scientists the world over all do this. The panda, Ailuropoda melanoluca, I think. Ursus maritimus, polar bear, and Ursus arctos, the grizzly bear. There's an organization, the International Code for Binomial Nomenclature. Oh, I'm sorry, that's the book. So there's a book that describes how to name everything, and these names are approved by that committee, the International Naming Congress. And a big part of what they do is they prevent duplicated names. So a taxon is a single category into which related organisms are placed. The plural taxon is taxa. And there's a hierarchy of groups, from the broadest to the most specific. I hope you've seen this before. Domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. So domain is the biggest and the broadest. Then kingdom is one step smaller, all the way down to species. Please note, we don't talk about phylums for plants. We use the word division. That's a kind of picky detail, but there it is. So, do you know this mnemonic? Kings play chess on Fridays, generally speaking. That's how you remember a KPCOFGS for kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. I'm not asking you to remember this, but if you've taken biology course or have any expectation of taking any more biology courses, you should probably get that in your head. The KP. Oh, in KP Kafkas. KP Kafkas. It's another way to remember it. So here in the kingdom, Animalia, you have bears, all kinds of bears, fox, squirrel, snakes, and even a sea star. But when you go down to phylum, well, these are the chordates. That means you have a backbone. Sea stars, that's not a sea star, that's a starfish. Starfish and sea stars, none of those have backbones. Snakes do. And then we go down to the class, Mammalia. So what do mammals all have? Mammary glands. They make milk for their young. Snakes don't have mammary glands. Now, when you go down one more, order, Carnivora. Carnivores eat meat. Squirrels do not eat meat. Then finally, there's different types of carnivores. We're looking at Ursidae, which are basically the ursids, the bears. Now, within the family, there are different genus. Genera is the plural. And the genus Ursus has a few species in there, and there's the grizzly bear, Ursus arctos. So that's an example of KP Kafkas, top to bottom. Okay, I need to take a short break. Okay, break's over. Where am I going? Going with that, going over here. So, classification of humans. We already did bears. I'm not going to do that. So here, domain is the highest level. Then kingdom. Kingdom is like animals, and plants are separate kingdoms. So I do just want to talk about domains. There's 3 domains. Archaea and Eubacteria are 2 separate domains. They have prokaryotes, which means it has no nucleus. And Eukarya, they are the ones, all those cells have a nucleus. So Archaea live in harsh environments, and you just don't see them around everyday life too often. They live in hot places, acidic, salty, cold, deep underwater, under lots of pressure. Eubacteria, those are just the ordinary bacteria that are here, there, and everywhere. We've got billions living in our intestines, and they're all over the world. Not hard to find bacteria. Remember, bacteria do not have a nucleus, so their DNA is just sitting inside the cell along with everything else. Then there's Eukarya, and they have a nucleus. And nucleus is where the DNA is stored. So here's our last universal ancestor. The Eubacteria were probably the first thing to evolve. It's a race between the Archaea and the Eubacteria. But then those turned into the eukaryotes. And there's protists, different kinds of protists. Plants evolved, and then more stuff. And then funguses, and then animals. So animals are pretty late on the grand scheme of things here. So these are the 3 domains: Eubacteria, Archaea, and Eukarya, and these are some of the kingdoms: Animalia, fungi, plantae. There's dozens others. They just aren't listed on this particular drawing. Okay, so how do we do modern taxonomy? We group things by structure. Structures that look alike, homologous. I'm not going to get into that word. How do we know they're alike? We look at the embryos. How do they develop? I'll show you a picture of that. And also we can look at DNA and RNA and amino acids to see what mostly DNA, which that tells us about how closely things are related to. So a homologous structure, here's a human. There's our 4 fingers and a thumb, our wrist bones, our ulna and radius, so that our forearm can rotate, and then not femur, what's that called? Ulna, radius, humerus. The humerus, because if you hit your elbow right there, it gives you a funny tingling feeling, and that funny is where we get the word humerus. These are the same bones that you can find in the front leg of a cheetah. Same finger bones, same knuckles, just a little different shape, same wrist, radius, ulna. It's also the same as the flipper of a whale. Same exact structure. See the colors? And then the fingers are really long here. And it's the same thing in the wing of a bat. There's the humerus, radius, ulna, and then the fingers. So there's a bunch of skin in here to fill out the wings so it can fly. So these structures are fundamentally all the same. So they had a common ancestor, which actually was an amphibian that looked a lot like a fish, that had these bones. So this kind of structure gives us a big clue about the fact that humans, cheetahs, whales, and bats are all related from some single common ancestor that was also a mammal. Now, if you look at the embryo, there's the sperm, there's the egg, and that's what makes a fertilized egg. And then several weeks later, the embryo looks like this and this. These all look pretty much the same. You've got an eye thing up here. You've got a dot there that I can't remember if that becomes the brain or the ear. Then some bumps down here that eventually turn into vertebra and a long tail. And this turns into this. Now this definitely looks like a fish. This does not look like a fish. This looks like still an embryo, but you got 4 limbs here. 4 limbs, 4 limbs, 4 limbs. The eye, the brain dot is getting bigger. And then you go a little further. Now this looks kind of like a fetus. Well, those look like 4 legs. Those don't look like arms and legs. It's 4 legs. And there's definitely a tail. And this is an ear, well, like a pig. I was going to guess sheep, but close enough. Well, that's definitely a beak there. And that head doesn't look anything like a human. So that's a chicken. And then here's the tortoise. And look at that. There's the shell already in place just a few months into development. So these embryos can tell us a lot about evolution just by looking. So here we go with the cladogram. These show how organisms are related based on shared characteristics. So these all have a backbone. Oh, well, the lancelet doesn't have a backbone, but they do have a spine, a spinal cord. And then this one has a vertebra, a backbone. Grouper has jaw bones. Then the fish turned into something with 4 legs, salamander. And they started having eggs that turn, and turtles lay eggs, and then mammals, among other things, have hair. So you can see the characteristics here. We usually don't list them there. It's usually implied. So there's a cladogram for people. Okay. So the view of taxonomy changed dramatically when Charles Darwin published On the Origin of Species in 1859. 1859 is when evolution hit the market and it became a viable idea. Darwin did a wonderful job of gathering tremendous evidence. And a friend of his, whose name I forget, was a much tougher person than Darwin. Darwin was kind of a nice guy and wouldn't argue a lot. Oh, what was the name of that guy? But there was somebody else who did a lot of arguing for Darwin in favor of evolution. So actually, the idea of evolution got adopted in the scientific community relatively quickly, over 1, 2, 3 decades, and then everybody's like, oh, okay, yeah, I guess that is the way it works. Now, so life got started over 3.5. It was 3.7 billion years ago. I should change that. And now it's diversified into millions of species that we see today. So we're trying to classify all these things with a taxonomic classification. And we want this classification to show us, to tell us, to use Darwin's work of evolution. So, in general, the greater the resemblance between 2 species, the more recently they diverged from a common ancestor. So if they look a lot alike, then they probably were recently, they probably split apart more recently. I don't look much like a fox, but I look a whole lot more like a fox than I do like a starfish. So my common ancestor with a fox is going to be a whole lot closer than my common ancestor with a starfish. That's the point. Oh, so yeah. I'm going to skip that part. That's a little overkill. So bees, wolves, and humans, same idea. I look a whole lot more like a wolf than I do a honeybee, but all 3 of us are animals. So back in here, there's some single animal that's ancestor to all of us. And then here is a carnivore that was an ancestor to me and the wolf, but not the bee. Okay. And convergent evolution is a threat to all this stuff, but we don't talk about this until after we get done with the Caminal lab. So I'm getting ahead of myself here and here. So at this point, what I'm asking you to do is to, you know what, I'll do the directions for the Caminal lab separately. Oh, especially because that's going to be a separate day. So at this point, I think I can say that's all, folks.